What's going on, guys? It's Bromley. I'm going to answer some questions from the Patreon page. This comes from Daniel Earp, and it's a kind of a general question about specificity. Should you do archless bench pressing almost all the time and only arch when prepping for a meet or a test? And similarly with high bar squats, should you do high bar narrow stance squats most of the time and only really low bar when prepping? And this is a really good question, and it cuts to the core of how we organize more specific and non-specific movements and how we see developmental movements versus competitive movements. That is, the movements that actually grow you, make you stronger, add muscle, and give you a big margin for error, make you more well-rounded, versus the ones that are best for demonstrating strength, for moving the maximal amount of weight within the rules of whatever type of meet you're doing. So I'm going to get to this as a really good one to kind of go over. This is one of the most universal programming principles. It's it's involved in periodization. You see it pop in periodization, and it's not necessarily specific to any one form. It's not like linear periodization or block periodization or even concurrent periodization somehow absolves itself from having to abide by this principle. This principle is that basically the further away you are from a meet or a test or a competition, the less specific you're going to train. The basic idea of arranging stressors is that you should aim, again, build a base. That's where base strength comes from. Not enough of you guys are putting attention into widening out your base by being well-rounded and prioritizing developing yourself. Everybody wants to jump into specificity, which just intuitively should always be closest to the meet. You can't train with optimal specificity all the time. Soccer players and baseball players and basketball players, that would mean they just play games. And we know that that wouldn't develop the best athlete. You need time and attention and resources focused to different things to develop you further. And then you want to be able to take those qualities and apply it in the game setting. Now, the closer you are to a game, the more you're trying to sharpen the saw, so to speak, by taking all of those qualities and further developing them in the context of exactly how you're going to play. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to be lost. Doesn't matter how good you are, it doesn't matter how well-rounded you are. If you're not good in the context of how you play, you're not going to play as well as you could. So further away from a meet, we have your base. And this is everything that is non-specific. It is very broad work. You're going to be working different energy systems. You want to aim to be well-rounded. You want to aim to fix weaknesses. That's the big one. There's a lot of different ways to do this, and a lot of different training methods will organize this in kind of a different way. Like concurrent periodization, what you might think of as conjugate or like DUP, it'll do a lot of this throughout the year. And then different programs will have more variation or less. Like there's plenty of power lifters that don't really deviate that much from the big three or close variation to the big three, and they might even be kind of sparse year round with how much isolation or accessory they do. There's definitely those programs, but even relative to how that program's outlined, they'll be engaging with different percentages, different rep ranges, different thresholds further away from a meet. And as you get closer to the meet, even those programs will cut out movements that are more varied, and they will become more and more specific, specifically in the threshold. They'll get heavier, closer to what you're going to do in contest. Now, something like block is going to really segment these. So they're going to be mesocycles that are more focused. Each one is more compartmentalized. So this one will be super varied. And, this is what you might think of as like an accumulation phase. And that's where it's like high rep. And then you go into these blocks that are a little heavier, less varied. And then ultimately you get into actual contest prep, which is not really varied at all. And this is as specific as it gets. And this is where you're basically doing pure meet prep. The heaviest weights are going to come here. The most technically relevant type of practice is going to come here. So again, this is universal. Even West Side, which is super concurrent, has you do the same thing all the time. You're varying the movements, but you're always training heavy. You're always doing accessory work, always doing speed work. Even Louis has talked about the need for a taper. That's an element of increasing specificity. You're increasing recovery. A lot of the guys like Wenning and Tate will have you train a lot more specifically even in a conjugate type setup, as you get closer to a meet, you'll eliminate a lot of the variations. You're not going to be doing a bunch of ridiculous specialty bar work. You're going to be in your gear. You're going to be practicing how you play. That is universal. So there's a lot of different ways, but the basic tenet is universal. So this question specifically regarding, let's say, bench pressing and squatting. And these are, and we can even do this with deads, because this is a really good example, and there's plenty of examples I can call from to talk about this. So less specific would be almost like a bodybuilding type setup. That's no arch, right? Whereas over here you have your contest setup, which is super high arched. And similarly for a squat, you're going to have, a low bar. You're talking about the bar really low. You're talking about really wide stance, limited range of motion. This is where that type of squatter is going to be the strongest, be able to move the most weight. But over here you have, again, what's developmentally better, what's going to grow you better, what's going to put you in a disadvantaged position. That's a tenet of this. More disadvantaged positions to a point tend to develop you better than very, very, very optimized positions. Over here with deadlifts, you might have conventional as the main builder. If you're a sumo deadlift, you're going to do sumo closer to the meet. Ed Cohen is the best example of that. He would do conventional year round, and he talked about 6 or 8 weeks out, he would start to incorporate sumo pulling. Now, he had kind of a closer hybrid stance. It was really easy for him to transition from one to the other. I would say the more optimized you are as a sumo puller, the less direct carryover you're going to be. Conventional deads will still make you stronger, but you might have to be a little more careful with how you bleed that into getting your sumo technique dialed in. Cohen was a type of lifter who could benefit from one and go right into the next. They were very closely correlated. So it's important to know that as a lifter. Similarly, with high bar and low bar, if you're a really, really, really good low bar squatter, you might benefit from high bar just because you've been neglecting it. It puts you in a different position, hits your quads more, puts you through more range of motion, and that might grow you a little bit better, but that might not give you the straight bleed over as far as technical carryover. You might need more time to sharpen that spear with regards to getting your low bar on point. And again, similarly with a high arch. So there's 2 questions at play here. One is, what is going to grow you the most? And 2 is, how much practice do you need to take that growth and funnel it into a very contest-specific setup? And that is going to be subtly different for each person. There's not a universal answer to that. It's important to know that these dynamics exist. If all you do is, say, super high arch benches, you might be able to get pretty strong doing that. But as just kind of a cheap thought experiment, think about how much you might be leaving on the table by never disadvantaging yourself, by going through a little more range of motion, by working a different grip, by putting yourself in a more disadvantaged spot that might force growth, especially after stagnation sets in. Same reason we do deficit deadlifts. That's the reason you might soften your arch in a bench press. That's the reason you might practice different depths or different stances with a squat. And I think over a long period of time, it's vital. It's not just vital, it is a very easy way to round yourself out and prevent stagnation. So for you powerlifting technicians, and as much as you spend time dealing with those powerlifting specific setups, and especially if you're new, you're going to find that you get really good really fast because the better mechanical advantage and the short range of motion, you adapt skill wise to setups like that very, very, very fast. The longer the range of motion is, the more complex a movement is, the longer the road to kind of get good and comfortable and efficient there. But if you can reduce a squat to a very wide stance, very short, down and up, where you just look like a scissor jack, and once you get that down and you start practicing that, you'll be amazed at how quickly you get stronger. Same thing with partials. If you're new to doing pin presses, or let's say higher box squats or rack pulls, you'll find that you get strong at those very, very quickly. So the optimization is there early on, and you can notice yourself climbing, and you're going to want to instinctively just do that all the time, because you're going to feel like, oh my God, I'm so strong here. I only want to practice my low bar squat. And there's a point where diminished returns set in, and now you're up against using that sole optimized position as a stressor. The better you get at it, the less return you get from it. So that's important to note. So it's not in your best interest just to do that and nothing but that all the time. If that was the case, accessory would never come into the discussion. If that was the case, periodization wouldn't come into the discussion. It would just be go as heavy as you can and your most advantaged setup all the time and keep growing forever. But that's not how this works. So you have to take time to back off. So when we're talking about training organization, it is really just to put off diminished return, which basically says the more you do something, the less of a stimulus you get from it, the less it causes you to grow. So going into the journey, for example, of a low bar squatter, you're going to find somebody who's newer, say within training a couple years, maybe hasn't been really dialing in their low bar that long overall, but now it's starting to click. So they're doing each workout and they're finding that they're getting these quantum leaps. So if we go week by week, and this is pretty normal for someone that's new, you might spend a couple months on this upswing where every workout it feels better, every workout you're moving more weight, and then you might do this for some extended period of time because that's all you want to do, and you're looking at months over here doing the same thing, trying to keep that upswing, trying to reproduce it. Now eventually, as you get stagnant right here, just like with all lifts, you're going to start to wonder, okay, what do I do next? Now, one easy tenet is to reset and go with a different training threshold. Okay, that's one easy way. You put off diminished returns. You introduce novelty. You change the recovery dynamic. You change the degree of specificity. So reps, that's an easy one, right? You just reset your program. So if you're doing a linear periodization scheme, this represents the upswing, and then eventually you have to reset and build back up once you get stagnant. The movements are also very, very relevant to this, and you can very easily do this by reestablishing a base period. Now that's, yes, part of that is changing the rep range, doing more volume, doing less weight, giving yourself time to adapt. But if you can also take the opportunity to incorporate, it doesn't have to be the only thing you can do. You can still very much incorporate some of your contest specific work. But if you're adding in accessories, you want to be more disadvantaged. And that is going to cause you to get more well-rounded. It's going to cause your body to grow in a way that handles that extra range of motion, that handles those new and unfamiliar positions, and then the result is you grow muscle. So now your quads are going to be a little stronger. Your glutes, hamstrings, upper back all had to negotiate this more cumbersome movement, and by the time you get good at that, now you're on this upswing again with these movements. Eventually, you start to go back to low bar, and once you're back on low bar, you are going to see this new upswing from week to week. You are going to see every week as you move across that learning curve, you're going to feel stronger, more comfortable, more confident. You'll be able to apply that new development you got from that disadvantaged position to this more optimized position. So this ebb and flow back and forth is ultimately the concept. It's the conceptual component behind all of the programming. If we're talking about periodization in any capacity, we're talking about arranging training stressors so we can hit all the different thresholds we need to grow either at the same time or segment it across a longer period of time. And we're talking about changing the movements. In fact, an interesting point about Westside is the original conjugate method. And Verkhoshansky even said there was a forum 10 or so years ago where he talked about it a little bit. He said Westside is not conjugate. Original conjugate was actually, it was a type of block periodization. The special exercises were ran over a mesocycle. They only rotated every mesocycle, not every workout. And the idea was you would build on these special exercises and they would have an arrow. They would be focused towards an end goal. So it was a type of phase potentiation where this exercise would improve this exercise, which would improve this exercise, which leads you to an optimal contest performance. And that was actually the heart of the original Russian conjugate program. And what Westside does is it's considered complex parallel training, which is concurrent and rotating the movements every single week. So that idea of getting skill in a certain movement, taking a number of training sessions to get better at this new foreign movement, and then applying that to something that is more relevant to your competition, that is extremely powerful if you do it right. Now, obviously, there's more opportunity for pitfalls. Obviously, it's a little more complex, and everybody's going to have kind of a time frame that they need, a different time frame to get good enough at these other exercises, and a different time frame to get that to transfer over. Also, you have to be careful with your exercise selection, because if you're picking wonky exercises that are too different, that are too foreign, you're not going to get the trade-off. If you're a really long femored squatter and high bar is very, very problematic for you, you might find that the amount of weight that you have to drop to get good at it, it really whatever you get out of it, whatever benefit you get out of it, if you're a 700 squatter, but you have to drop to 315 to do high bar work because it's so awkward, that's not going to give the same type of growth as if you find a variation that gets you closer to something like 70% or 80% of what your actual low bar competition max is. So you have to keep that thread of relevance, and you have to be very careful with that. Easy way to do that is, if you want to include a more exotic or a very different movement, just put it further down the list. Do things that are more similar early on, and have an exercise in. If you're not sure about the carryover, it could come as a second or third exercise in your workout, so you're not putting all the eggs in that basket. That's a way to do it. So I think everybody should have some comfort, if it's not a true blue narrow stance high bar squat, at least something that is closer than your competition squat, assuming you're a wide stance low bar squatter. For high bar squatters, honestly, I'm a high bar squatter. My feet are pretty medium. I actually got a lot of benefit out of going wider and going to a slightly high box and practicing on getting my hips into it. That was very beneficial. So whatever your movement is, there are periods of training where I think you will be benefited from focusing on kind of the opposite movement. There are a lot of programs, Knuckles put out programs, and there have been others that alternate between sumo and conventional. So as much as I don't like sumo as a test of strength, I do like it as a developmental exercise. And if you're a conventional only puller, you might find that gives a little something extra to your glute and hip development. Benching. Now that's a tricky one, because I do like to bench without a super high arch. I bench with a really high arch, a really advantaged narrow grip, down to my belly button and back up. And I have very short arms and a long torso. So my range of motion was no joke, like 8 inches or less. And that presented a problem, because just like this cycle I showed you, I was developing as I got more and more skill in that movement, but I wasn't developing physically. It was more like if I was just doing, top third, if I was doing like 4 board benches, that's what it felt like. So I was able to handle more and more and more weight, but it didn't look like I worked out. I wasn't doing enough. So I could have been doing more accessory, or I could have been incorporating different bench variations. And that's what I should have been doing. It's what I did eventually. But I saw how you could get super specialized in that movement and then hit a wall because you're not doing anything to really develop you. You're just kind of jerking yourself off with the most advantaged position you could possibly get into, and that's not the same thing. Now, I'm not going to tell you to lie flat, flare your elbows, and bench like a bodybuilder, because I think that will cause a lot of problems with lifters, especially as you chase higher numbers. But I think it is okay to relax the scapular retraction a little bit. I think it is okay to relax the arch a little bit. I mean, they've even done benching with like Duffalo bars to get a little deficit, or you could put fat grips on the bar to get a little deficit, assuming your shoulders can handle it. You can do dumbbells to get the same effect. There are a lot of options. There are a lot of ways to grow your upper body. Your upper body specifically grows from a lot of variety. So yeah, you don't need to go flat back, flared elbow, but I would absolutely recommend getting out of your comfort zone with the same rote movement that you repeat over and over and over that puts you in the strongest possible position. Use machines, use dumbbells. The upper body grows. The bench press grows from variety. Yes, you need practice bench pressing in your competitive setup, but over a long period of time, you need long periods, definite, concentrated periods of physical development, and your upper body has so many different moving parts. You need a lot of movements to get it to grow. That's kind of the general wisdom. So keep that in mind. I hope this answers some questions for that. If there are any more questions, leave it in the comment box. Once again, check out the Facebook group. We'll answer a lot of questions there and have a more in-depth conversation. Link is at the bottom. Thanks for watching, guys. Till next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.